Welcome. I'm Ted Everingham. I'm speaking to you from the historic Alger House at the Grosse Pointe War Memorial on the shores of Lake St. Clair. Just down the road from us is the city of Detroit, and tonight we're going to talk about its bankruptcy and what we can learn from it. And we're going to do that with Nathan Bomey. Nathan is a business reporter for USA Today and the author of 3 nationally published nonfiction books, including his first, the one we'll talk about tonight, called Detroit Resurrected to Bankruptcy and Back. This book grew out of his coverage of the Detroit bankruptcy for the Detroit Free Press, where he worked for a number of years before joining USA Today in 2015. Nathan is also serving as the principal scriptwriter for a full-length documentary film about Detroit's bankruptcy. In addition to Detroit Resurrected, Nathan is also the author of Bridge Builders, Bringing People Together in a Polarized Age. I'd like to talk about that some night, Nathan. Another called After the Fact, The Erosion of Truth and the Inevitable Rise of Donald Trump. Another subject we could explore some night. Nathan now lives in the Washington, D.C. area where he works for USA Today. He lives there with his wife, Catherine, who grew up in the Ann Arbor area, a 2006 graduate of Eastern Michigan University. Nathan, it's great to have you with us. Thank you.
So good to be here. This is exciting.
I've already introduced you to Nathan Rapoli. Nathan is a freshman, Liam, not Rapoli. I've got my 2 journalists confused here. Liam is a freshman at Albion College and a member of the Ford Institute for Leadership in Public Policy and Service, interested in a career in either teaching English or journalism. And I hope, Liam, in the few minutes we've known each other, I hope you pursue the latter. I think you'll enjoy tonight. Liam is going to have questions for you. If others of you have questions, please use the chat function of Zoom. We'll curate those questions here and pass them on in your behalf. But first, Nathan, give us your overview. Tell us what you'd like us to know about Detroit Resurrected. And please don't be afraid to go behind the scenes and tell us what it's like for a pretty young reporter to cover a really big story, a once-in-a-lifetime story.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that. It's really great to be here. And it's, to me, always exciting to get a chance to talk about the Detroit bankruptcy. I'm at my heart a bit of a bankruptcy nerd, which probably sounds strange that kind of person actually exists. But if they do, it's me. I find these things fascinating. Of course, you can't grow up in Michigan without knowing a thing or two about bankruptcy. And that's sort of how I got involved in this story, because you got the General Motors bankruptcy, the Chrysler bankruptcy, the Borders bankruptcy. I covered pieces of all of those before this case started. And this is a bit of a unique event for me because I often bankruptcy. We'll kind of do just the full picture of everything that happened and kind of give people an overview, talk about some of the main themes, and then take questions from there. We'll do a little bit condensed version of that maybe. But what I want to do is just give you a flavor for what it was like to cover the bankruptcy now that we are 8+ years after it was filed and nearly 7 years after it ended. And so, time also gives us some perspective on things. And like Ted mentioned, I'm also immersed in basically this full-length documentary film that's going to be released sometime soon. Cross your fingers, probably 2022. That is going to be about the bankruptcy and provide some new perspectives that weren't even in my book. So that's exciting too. And we can talk a little bit about that as well. So story is fresh of mind for me, even if it's not for you. 4:06 p.m. Thursday, July 18th, 2013, the city of Detroit hit rock bottom. It was a day of infamy for Detroit. The city filed the largest Chapter 9 bankruptcy in U.S. history. It was a moment where the city's financial collapse was exposed for the world to see. And a moment of despair, I think you could say, for many people, because it was the first time for many people that hadn't been paying attention to realize that Detroit had fallen into disrepair. This was the arsenal of democracy, a place that put America on wheels, put the world on wheels, that helped create the middle class, that gave us Motown, that invented the assembly line, somehow got from that point to a peak of about 2 million people in the 1950s to a point where it had less than 700,000 on the day it filed for bankruptcy. How did it happen? And what were they going to do about it? And the book that I wrote, Detroit Resurrected, here's the paperback version here, which now is 5 years. The original is 5 years old now, which is wild to say. Tells the story of what they did about it. I didn't dig into the history as much, a little bit, but we do that a little bit more in the documentary, so that'll be fun. But tell you a little bit about myself first, though. So I actually had been a reporter in my hometown newspaper and in a couple of papers in Ann Arbor for several years before I joined the Detroit Free Press in 2012. Didn't come thinking I'd be covering the Detroit bankruptcy, though. I came to cover General Motors. That was actually my beat. And some people sometimes say you have one reporter who is devoted to one company. And I can say, yes, not only that, the Free Press used to have 3 reporters devoted to General Motors in the 1990s. So that illustrates to you how important that beat was at one point, and still is, to the Free Press, as they still have a reporter dedicated to GM. But that was my role at that point, and it was an incredible beat, really cool national beat. And I covered that for about 18 months until we started to see the clouds forming over the city of Detroit. And I was sitting in a meeting one day, a newsroom meeting, and our number 2 editor said to the people at the table, I guess, if the city files for bankruptcy, because we could see it coming, could see the clouds forming, like I said. If the city files for bankruptcy, she said, this is going to be the biggest story in Detroit since the 1967 rebellion or riots, whatever you want to call it. And I perked up at that point, and I hadn't been thinking too much about how I might be involved in this story. But I thought to myself after that meeting, I can't be here at the biggest newspaper in Detroit, in Michigan, and have the biggest story since 1967 pass by me without being involved in some capacity. So after that, I sent an email to our editors and said, "Hey, I'd love to be involved, if in some way, in the coverage here." Not thinking that I'd have a big piece of it, just thinking that I might have a piece of it, knowing that this was going to be a team effort, because there's no way that a single person could do it all. Fast forward several weeks and another newsroom meeting, and we can see again at this point the city of Detroit has an emergency manager in place. This is a person that the governor has appointed to basically take control of the city of Detroit, because the city's finances had gotten into a point where they couldn't pay their bills, and the city services were in total abject decline. And so the emergency manager, a person named Kevin Orr, a bankruptcy attorney from Washington, D.C., who went to the University of Michigan as a student, but hadn't really had much experience with Michigan other than the fact that he helped lead the legal aspects of the Chrysler bankruptcy. He is now the emergency manager in the city of Detroit, which means the mayor of Detroit, Dave Bing at the time, was basically sidelined. The city council sidelined. They were still there. They were still able to, sort of advisory votes, you could say, but their votes were not considered to be binding in any way. They were sort of just a recommendation, or just here to speak on behalf of the people who have voted for the mayor and for these elected officials on the council. And I think we should talk a little bit about that suspension of democracy and the echoes that that I think that echoes more today even so than it did then, because we've had such a national conversation of what does democracy mean to us. And I think the city of Detroit, and this being an event about democracy, is a really just an incredible representation of both the ups and the downs, the positives and the negatives of democracy. Because on one hand, you have you have the triumphs of democracy in Detroit. Like I said, it was literally named the Arsenal of Democracy. Detroit helped preserve freedom for the world by transforming into this powerhouse of manufacturing during World War II, supplying planes and weapons to the Allies and to America, and to the American Army and the American military to win the war. So we helped preserve democracy. And then we get to a point where suddenly democracy is suspended. But some people are going to say that never should have happened. There's still controversy to this day. And I understand why. On the other hand, though, you also have to confront the fact that democracy allowed Detroit to fall into disrepair. Our system allowed it to get to the point where 40% of the streetlights out. You had an average, police were taking an average, and fire were taking an average of 30 minutes to get to the scene of a major crime. You had tens of thousands of blighted buildings, abandoned properties throughout the city. You had a property tax system that was completely broken. They weren't able to collect many of the taxes they were owed. You had streetlights that are out throughout the city, fire hydrants that don't work, a firehouse that was using a fax machine as a jerry-rigged machine to set off alerts whenever an emergency call would come out, would come through. They didn't have the emergency call system, so what they would do, they have a fax come through and knock off an aluminum can. The aluminum can would fall into the ground, make a noise. They say, "We have a fire," and they'd look at the address on the fax, and that's how it was working, because they were fundamentally broke. Which gets me to back to that meeting where I'm sitting there a few weeks before the bankruptcy, and they say, and we need to do a forensic audit of what happened to the city of Detroit's finances over the last 50 years. And we're going to assign John Gallagher, who is a longtime reporter at the Detroit Free Press, and Nathan Bomey to it. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? You've assigned me to do what? And I was caught off guard. But I recall a few weeks earlier, I had volunteered. So I volunteered to be involved in some capacity. I didn't know they were going to make me do a 50-year investigation into what happened in the city of Detroit, but I was in John being this class reporter, legend in Detroit. I was honored years later to write a letter of recommendation for him to get into the Michigan Journalism Hall of Fame. To be paired with him was fun, and they actually paired us together for a very specific reason, which is that John had been a reporter in Detroit for 25 years or so. And he knew the city in and out. He lived in the city. He understood it. He knew everybody in it. And they felt like he would provide that institutional wisdom and knowledge that we needed for this story. But then they also felt like my perspective as someone who was fairly new to Detroit, although I growing up in Saline in the Ann Arbor area. I went to Eastern Michigan University, certainly been to Detroit many times, but not from Detroit. And maybe I could provide a little bit of a fresh perspective. For example, on the question of, wasn't this all Coleman Young's fault? Because when you ask someone in Detroit, outside of Detroit, why Detroit went broke, a lot of people would say it was all Coleman Young's fault. Coleman Young, the longest serving mayor of Detroit from 1974 to 1994, first African-American mayor of the city of Detroit. Many Michiganders still blame Detroit's demise on Coleman Young. I come in here having absolutely no opinion of Coleman Young or what role he may or may not have played in this. Kwame Kilpatrick. I mean, I had been to events with Kwame Kilpatrick, asked him questions with my microphone, or with my recorder, and that sort of thing. But I didn't have, this raging opinion about what role he may have played in the city's demise. And so it was a great pairing. And what John and I did was we figured we got to find out, how do we tell this story of the city's economic and financial decline. And I did what any good older millennial would do. I Googled it. I was like, so tell me what happened. Give me the history of the finances. And what we wanted to do was to dig up real numbers and figure out how did this happen? How did the city's budget collapse? Well, I have bad news. That kind of thing isn't really on Google. It's not there. And we ran into a roadblock and realized that's not going to help. So we started calling libraries, figured out that the only place that had the records we needed was the Burden Historical Collection at the Detroit Library, so Public Library. So I ended up in the basement of the Detroit Public Library for 3 weeks, going through these old audits from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, up through the modern times, and figuring out what happened to the city's budget. And I'm literally hand transposing these numbers into my little Excel spreadsheet, and I compile the spreadsheet of the city of Detroit's financial decline over 50, actually really 60 years. And it was absolutely fascinating because I was actually tracking things that I ended up not needing in the end, but things like I could tell you how many swimming pools Detroit had in 1978. Like I could tell you how many parks they had, how many police officers they had, all this crazy stuff. And it was just interesting because you could actually see the city declining over time, even if they don't realize it. In the documentary, we have a line from a Detroiter who kind of compares it to that story of the frog in the pot. And like, you may not realize it if you're boiling gradually over time. And I think a lot of anyone who is maybe covering the city over, as a reporter during that time may not have seen the decline, but in the aggregate, you can clearly see it. Is that the city's property tax base went from something like, in modern numbers, $45 billion in the 1950s to $8 billion today, meaning it declined by a factor of, by several factors. And what does that mean? That means that they had no tax base left. They had nothing from which to draw value to pay for the services that the city of Detroit's residents deserve, or to pay for the pensions that they've promised to the city's retirees. And that is of course what leads to the greatest clash in this bankruptcy, which is, what do we do with the little money the city has and the huge pile of debt that they've accumulated? So on July 18th, 2013, when they filed for bankruptcy, it is a cataclysmic event in one way, but perhaps it was actually the day the city of Detroit finally came to terms with what had happened to it, whether or not it was, regardless of your opinion of how Detroit went broke, it doesn't change the fact that the city was broke. And that's, I think, critical to this story, because we can sit here and debate for a long time how Detroit went broke, and that's the title of that project as we ended up publishing it. But the reality is, you could blame it on any number of things. The auto industry's collapse, the Great Recession, the predatory lending, racism writ large, the white flight, as part of that, corruption, borrowing, too much spending, not enough spending. Republicans, Democrats, pretty much anything you want or anyone you want to blame. The reality is, you would probably be right. You would probably be right, at least in some respect, because it was this confluence of events that dragged Detroit into bankruptcy. Now, what percentage right? That's going to be up to you. What I tried to do with Detroit Resurrected, the book, and with my coverage, was to focus on, what do you do about it? And that's what this story is all about. So as I ended up, after we published that, I ended up becoming the lead reporter on the bankruptcy. That story went viral, was a huge hit. And it was this dynamic experience to cover it. 32,000 pensioners, 170,000 creditors, $18 billion of debt, 700,000 residents, and 66,000 pieces of art owned by the Detroit Institute of Arts, whose collection was at risk of potential liquidation because of this bankruptcy. And that it is one of the elements of this story that makes it so unique. But it was a case unlike any other up until that point. Puerto Rico filed for a form of bankruptcy a couple of years later. Much different case. If you wanted to, we could talk about that some other time. But the reality is that Detroit was the largest city bankruptcy of any kind, and still is, by a long shot. Jefferson County, Alabama, being the second largest municipal bankruptcy up to that point. That was only 2 or 3 billion. This is 18 billion. The stakes are enormous. But there is one key aspect of Chapter 9 bankruptcy that I think is important to mention that makes it different from corporate bankruptcy. Chapter 9, a city cannot be forced to liquidate its assets. In Chapter 11, eventually a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which is reorganization, can be converted to Chapter 7, which is liquidation, if the judge decides that the company is better off dead than alive, in a sense that it's in the best interest of the creditors to liquidate, sell everything. You recall that's what happened to Toys R Us a couple years ago. They tried to reorganize, went into bankruptcy, thinking they were going to be able to do it, led by former Michigan Athletics director David Brandon as CEO. Didn't work out, company liquidated. Now, some of the assets have been revived and used for Macy's. They're kind of, reviving that as some toy shops. But the point is, Toys R Us is gone, as you know it. They can't do that with a city. You can't liquidate a city, but you are going to come under pressure to sell some assets if it means helping the pensioners and helping the retirees avoid huge pension cuts. Because when this started, the pensioners were facing cuts of maybe 30%, 40%, 50% of what they had been promised. And for the public policy students here, and anyone really, but I mean, especially for the public policy students on this call from Albion, I would say that one of the takeaways of the Detroit bankruptcy is that someday the bill does come due for the promises that have been made over years. And that's a lesson that in Washington, where I'm, right across the river from me in Arlington, Virginia, they might need to learn at some point, which is whatever the promise you want to make, it's fine, but at some point, paid for. And that's what happened in Detroit, because when you file for bankruptcy, you have to somehow resolve your debts. Not going to pay in full, probably, and the city of Detroit most definitely did not pay in full, but you're going to have to pay something, and it's going to have to be fair to your creditors. And so, what was fair in Detroit? I'll end on that. I mean, covering this case was dynamic. I'm sitting in the courtroom on a daily basis, often, and we're covering this clash of some of the greatest attorneys in the world who have descended onto the federal courthouse on Lafayette Boulevard with their gigantic stacks of papers, and they're like really like $10,000 suits. We're talking about attorneys who at the time were getting paid in somewhere in the order of $1,200 to $1,300 an hour to fight on behalf of their clients, their creditors, but also the city. And so this was, bankruptcy is a very weird world. Okay. Even if you think you know law, you may not until you encounter bankruptcy law, which is a bit more of a game to the people involved than you might think it is. And there's rivalries and that go back years, and people who don't like each other, and all of that is descending. So there's drama, and I try to bring that out in the book. And it's, these people, men and women, I should say, are, they're kind of like surgeons in some ways. That would be the best way to put it, which is that if you go to the ER and you have a life-threatening illness or injury, you don't want the ER physician to be you want that ER physician to be logical, be really grounded, and to make a decision in your best interest based on, but maybe the doctor has to cut off your leg to save you, and to do so, they have to be very grounded, and they have to understand this is going to be traumatic, but this is in your best interest in the long term. That's kind of what bankruptcy attorneys are like, not emotional, even when they sort of act like they are. They don't really feel the same feels as you and I about these things, and that can be good and that can be bad. It's good if you have them fighting on your behalf, because you got to have someone who's going to go out there and fight for you. And so, but often it works in the reverse, where on the other side, you had creditors who wanted to liquidate the Detroit Institute of Arts. Even though they knew they couldn't legally force it, they felt that politically they could force it, because they knew the governor was overseeing this bankruptcy and that he could be politically inculcated if the city was forced to do this. So, as this case was resolved in the courtroom, dynamic place to be. Couldn't have my iPhone, couldn't have cameras, that's for sure. Couldn't call in, had to physically be there in person. And to cover the case, they did allow us laptops, though. We were in a separate room from the courtroom with a little live feed coming through. And I'm sitting next to my fellow reporters from the Detroit News, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Associated Press, Bloomberg, Reuters, all of us there on a regular basis. Occasionally you have even more folks, CNN and such. And it was extremely competitive. We're live tweeting, we're doing everything we can to serve our readers. And I would argue that journalism was at its finest in Detroit, because we performed a public service of telling the 32,000 pensioners, how might this affect you? And then telling the 700,000 residents how this might affect you as well. And then, hey, the bondholders and the financial community as well, how this might affect you. So, we can, I'll stop there. It was a fascinating experience. And, if you want to talk about the legacy of the case, basically where we stand today, we can do that as well. But I know there's lots of questions and we should get to that.
I always forget to unmute myself. I apologize for that. Nathan, that's amazing. What a great story and what a great opportunity for you. And I'm kind of vicariously sharing the excitement, the tension, the stress that must have gone along with it. You mentioned where are we today? And a good friend of ours sent in a message saying that we often talk about the bankruptcy as though it's fully behind us, when in fact some of the settlement terms require some substantial payments by the city in the next few years. The question is, how are we doing? Can Detroit make those payments? And if not, what happens?
Yeah, so I think that they're referring to the fact that the city will have to start making pension payments again in 2024, because essentially with the plan of adjustment, which was the reorganization plan that Detroit got approved by the federal judge, Stephen Rhodes, in 2014, he approved this 10-year plan for the city. Well, 10 years is going to be 3 years from now. So at that point, the city will be required to make pension payments again. What happened was a couple years after the case, it came out that the actions that they used were a little too optimistic. So they thought that pensioners would live not as long as they actually will live, which is this bizarre mortality thing that actuarial scientists get involved in. If there's any actuaries on the call, I apologize in advance for the fact that I'm going to say that actuarial science is actually more of an art, not so much a science. You're doing a little more guesswork. You're actually trying to predict things like how long will people live, and then how well will the stock market perform. I would say that 2 years ago I was quite concerned because of the fact that those pension payments were looking huge. After 2 years of the markets going through the roof, not quite as concerned now. I don't think we have seen the latest projections with those realities integrated. So I think that the numbers are going to look a lot better because the assets in those pension plans have performed decently over the last a lot better actually since the bankruptcy. But then I think they expected. But let me add this as well. One thing that's key, and I don't want to get too into the weeds because this is probably too boring for most people on the call, but Mayor Duggan has often criticized the fact that the bankruptcy leaders didn't cut the pension debt more than, and therefore leaving the city with more obligation to pay pensions now. That is a de facto. That is the same as saying he knows people won't. Let me say this. It is unlikely that people will understand that what that means is it's tantamount to an argument that they should have cut pensions more than they did. That's the only way that the city would have emerged from bankruptcy with less debt. Had they cut pensions more, there'd be less pension debt. That's how that works. So if Duggan wants lower pension payments, then what his argument is effectively they should have cut pensions more. He would never say that because that's politically not good for him, but that's the argument he makes. And in this documentary that we're doing, we had a chance to ask him about this. I can't spoil what he said about what he thinks about the bankruptcy, but I can tell you that it was surprising to me. And we'll leave it at that.
Okay. Liam, you're sitting patiently in Albion. Liam is a freshman at Albion College, aspires to perhaps be a journalist someday. Do you have a question for Nathan?
Yeah, I do. This is kind of more related to the covering of the story, but in today's media climate, it seems kind of really important for journalists to remove their personal feelings from their work. Could you speak about that and tell how your feelings propelled your coverage of this story in particular, especially as a new resident to Detroit?
Yeah. And I should clarify, and I've never actually lived in the city. I worked in the city, but I think it's a great question, and it's one that feels more relevant today than ever. I've written since then 2 books that actually touch on aspects of why people don't trust the media. Most recently, this book called Bridge Builders, which came out this year, wrote about how the media needs to do a better job of reconnecting and restoring trust with the public, and we can't just tell people to trust this. Deserve their trust. So this is a passion topic for me, and I appreciate you asking the question. In terms of how I handled it as a reporter for the Detroit Free Press, I would say twofold. Number one, the case was so fast paced and so much was happening that I didn't really have a lot of time sometimes to process what was my opinion about what was happening. And so that, in a very bizarre way, kind of helped. But the reality is that as journalists, we're trained to be as objective as possible, understanding that we have biases. This is something that journalists have come to realization about over the last couple years, is that we do have biases. Like, you're not going to be able to eliminate those, but what you can do as a journalist is be as fair as possible, and to give fair treatment to everybody. Doesn't mean you give equal treatment to both sides. Both sides journalism is also frowned upon, in the sense that if there's sometimes no moral equivalency. In this book, Bridge Builders, I write about the fact that sometimes bridges don't meet in the middle. Sometimes you got to build a bridge from one side to the other side. Reality is that sometimes there's not moral equivalency, but what we kept the focus on at the Free Press was public service and telling the public what they needed to know about this, because so many people were personally affected by this. Every zip code in the state of Michigan had at least one Detroit retiree. And of course, many retirees who lived elsewhere outside of the state of Michigan. So the impact is far and wide. And that's not even to speak of the city's services. Again, I mentioned before, in the streetlights out, all these blighted homes, all these city services that the people of Detroit pay taxes for. That, like, we as Americans, we have this expectation, and I think rightly so, that the police are going to come if you call 911, or the lights are going to be on the street at night, or that the home next to me, if it lights on fire, the firefighters will be able to come in time to deal with it. And so I think one of the things I tried to do, Liam, was to not lose sight of the fact that the bankruptcy at its very basic form was about giving Detroit a fresh start. And that sounds weird because a lot of people see bankruptcy as a form of failure. And it is, but it also provides you, but it's like when you hit rock bottom, you really have only one place to go but up. And I think Detroit was able to use this case as a way to begin rebuilding. I think a lot of the momentum the city has had since then is because it finally dealt with a lot of these core issues that it needed to deal with. Didn't save the city at all, didn't solve all the city's problems. So many issues still today: crime, education, blight. These are issues that took 60 years to happen. It's going to take at least 60 years to deal with them, if not longer. The city will never be the size as it was in the 1950s. I think that's understood at this point, but it can be a place that provides basic services to its residents. And I think they're on a slow path to getting there, but this is not going to be anything that happens overnight.
Great question, Liam. Thank you. And we're talking with Nathan Bomey from USA Today, but he, during the Detroit bankruptcy, was kind of the lead reporter for the Free Press in Detroit covering the bankruptcy. One of the fascinating things to me, Nathan, has always been the grand bargain. How the DIA was able to save that collection of art. Can you speak a little about that?
Certainly, yeah. The grand bargain is this term that my colleagues John Gallagher and Mark Stryker actually coined to refer to this deal that essentially ended the Detroit bankruptcy. It was a deal negotiated by Gerald Rosen, who is the chief judge of the U.S. District Court for Southeast Michigan, and was serving as the lead mediator in the bankruptcy. He basically had this crazy idea at some point, and he acknowledges it was crazy. He's doodling on a pad, and he comes up with this idea that says, we got the pensions on this side, we got the art on this side. These two issues are so unbelievably contentious, and we'll never be able to resolve them in any reasonable amount of time to get Detroit out of bankruptcy unless we force them to come to some sort of, to lock them in their destinies together. And that's what he concluded, is that we have to basically figure out a solution that enables them to both come up with some acceptable resolution. And so what he came up with this idea that he would raise money from outside sources to contribute to this trust that would essentially caused the pension cuts to be much lower than anticipated as a part of this bankruptcy, and then to allow the Detroit Institute of Arts to spin off its art as its own independent nonprofit, no longer owned by Detroit. Because when the city filed for bankruptcy, it was this very strange sort of quirk of history that the city owned this museum. That is not the case for most cities in the country. They do not usually own their art museums. They're usually often a nonprofit, but because Detroit was one of the richest cities in the world in the 1920s, the 1910s, really the Silicon Valley of its age, unbelievable architecture. You walk down through the city of Detroit downtown, every beautiful building, you look at the Cornerstone built in the 1920s, it was the Penobscot building. I mean, this amazing architecture reflective of the wealth at the time. Well, the city's rich folks at the time basically enabled the city of Detroit to purchase works by Van Gogh and Rembrandt and Picasso and Matisse, and Bruegel. I mean, Rodin, these unbelievable works of art that turn out to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And so, that's art that could be sold theoretically. Now, legally, could it be sold? That's a little bit of a matter of debate, but most experts would say the city had a right to sell the art, at least the art that it directly purchased, maybe not the art that was loaned to it. So he ended up raising $815 million from foundations like the Ford Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, the Knight Foundation, Kellogg, many others. And then also the state of Michigan matched the foundation money. And then the Detroit Institute of Arts went out, raised $100 million from its own donors, which included the GM Foundation, Ford Foundation, Ford Motor Company Foundation, I should say, and others. And so this was essentially the deal that allowed you to get out of bankruptcy. And the retirees voted to accept the deal by a wide majority. And I think that that's a pretty fascinating conclusion, that the retirees did something that was against their own interest in some ways. They were voting to accept these cuts. They could have fought for a long time. Now, I think legally they probably would have lost in the long term, but at least they could have kept fighting based on the principle that their pensions should not be cut. But they accepted a compromise. Listen, compromise, not something that we hear a lot about very often in Washington, that's for sure, but not in the political houses throughout this country. But this was a grand compromise, I think is almost a better way to put it than the grand bargain.
Well, it certainly saved the day for all of us, and certainly that art collection. Liam, do you have another question?
I do. This is kind of a more broad topic, but when there's this narrative that Detroit can't shake of decline and poverty and abandoned buildings and corruption. When you speak about Detroit to a national audience or to people who aren't from Detroit, how do you break through these misconceptions and bring home the point that Detroit is a big-hearted city?
Oh, it's a great question. Yeah, I think it's a real significant issue. And I have to say, unfortunately, the media, I can say, as part of the media, have been a big reason why that image continues to be perpetuated. And, basically, along with racism in general, which has certainly been a significant reason for the city's poor image throughout the world. What I try is talk about how the city's character is one of just true grit and resilience and history and love. And I think you emphasize things like that, and I think you talk about how this is the arsenal of democracy. This is a place that literally helped preserve freedom for the world. We can't let it sit here and fall into disrepair. We can't just write it off, and I think a lot of people wanted to do that, when the bankruptcy happened. And so, it's a very difficult thing, that one reporter, unfortunately, is not going to be able to change that image. But I do think it's really important for us to talk about the people of the city, especially, and this documentary is going to do a really great job of kind of bringing that to light too, because a lot of times you'll see hand-wringing over what people will call ruin porn, which is this idea that people like to look at pictures of really dilapidated, blighted buildings in Detroit. And it's certainly true. You can find any number of photo galleries online and click through and see the Packard plant and whatever else, properties in Detroit that, without a tree growing off the roof, that sort of thing. And I think we as journalists have a responsibility to not hide that sort of thing. We have to talk about it, but also to present the images of the liveliness and the energy and the hope in Detroit. Because when I had a chance to do the paperback version of this book, that I did a foreword, and I said, the bankruptcy was a collision of hope and despair. It really was. That's what it was. And I like to think that hope is winning the day in the end, despite the city's numerous problems.
Thank you. Another great question and a great answer. Couple
Ted,
things.
Ted,
There was,
excuse me. My name is Sandra, and I'm a native
Sandra?
Detroit. Yes, I'm
Sandra?
a native. Yes, I'm a
Sandra?
native Detroiter and African American.
Sandra, if you can present your question through the chat function, we'd appreciate it. We can pass those on to Nathan. Nathan, I started to say there was obvious tension between Kevin Orr, the emergency manager appointed before the bankruptcy, who in a sense was the dictator. He had the last say where the mayor, city council, the city administration didn't. And yet, as I read your book, I realized that he had a way of giving bits of administrative authority back to the city. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that question, and I'd love to hear what Sandra wanted to talk about too, because it sounded like she had something interesting. But I would say, yeah, when Kevin Orr was dealing with the bankruptcy, he had the power to do a lot more than he did. He could have done things like severed union contracts and could have sold off way more assets than he did. He could have made unilateral decisions, but instead he actually ended up deferring to the wisdom of the city council on a number of things, which is very interesting. So for example, he negotiated a regionalization of the water department, and which is something that the suburbs had wanted to do for a long time because they ultimately are the largest customer of the system. And the city was not able to provide the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department with the kind of investments it needed in public infrastructure. So it was a deal that seemed like it would benefit everybody. But yet it was contentious, of course. And this is a huge asset of the city. What do you do? Well, they ended up leasing the asset to this regional authority, and provided money back to the city to invest in the system within the city of Detroit. The city still owns the system, but they can get some investments for repairs and such. But that decision, Kevin Orr actually allowed the city council to vote on that. And even though he didn't have to do that, which I find to be interesting because he understood at that time that he couldn't rule as a dictator across the board, like you said. He had to incorporate the perspectives of the people who were elected, because you know what? He only had an 18-month term. He wasn't going to be here forever. Once he left, the city was going to have to, run itself again. And so he had to have buy-in from the people. And I think, the city's done a really good job of executing the plan that he outlined since then. Mike Duggan has been basically following the roadmap that Kevin Orr had laid out.
That's the thing that impressed me as I read the book, that Kevin Orr was in effect giving up authority that he had in order to wean the city off the dictatorship and kind of prepare it to do its own thing when he was no longer here. I found that really interesting and very wise on his part. I'm just looking at questions here on my screen, and I had one I just lost. Bear with me.
Yeah, I see we have a lot of good questions in the chat too, so that'll be.
Yeah, a lot of those I'm finding. There's a question that kind of makes you play lawyer here, but I know you touched on this in the book. There's a provision in the Michigan Constitution that says that public pension plans are contractual obligations of the state that, quote, shall not be diminished or impaired.
Yeah.
And yet pensioners, we're done with the bankruptcy. Pensioners are going to receive less than they thought they were going to get. How does that square with that constitutional provision?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question. This was a central question to the bankruptcy itself, which is, what happens to public pensions when you end up in bankruptcy? Not something that many people contemplated when they wrote that provision in the Constitution of Michigan, I believe in the 60s. The public policy students here probably know it better than me. I think it was the 60s where they wrote that into the Constitution. Of course, think about 1960s Michigan. This was a time when, you know, public unions and the UAW had significant power in the state of Michigan, and they wrote that into the Constitution in coordination with those unions. But there's actually a couple dozen states throughout the country that have similar provisions. And so this is not uncommon at all to have this sort of thing. But yes, the key word there, the key phrase is contractual obligations. It's a contract. Well, unfortunately, anyone who knows anything about bankruptcy knows that bankruptcy is literally designed to sever contracts. That's what happens. It's why, if you're a retailer, if you file for bankruptcy, you can get out of the leases that you have for the stores that you operate. And that's why a lot of times you see retailers end up in bankruptcy, because they can't deal with the leases otherwise. And why? Because federal law supersedes state law. That is something you learn in, you know, middle school civics, is that federal law takes precedent over state law. And so Judge Stephen Rhodes, who is, I think, guy who just kind of called balls and strikes in this bankruptcy and really was on the side of the city's residents, I think, by most accounts, including critics of the way the case ended, say that he looked out for the city's residents. He ultimately decided this was not a difficult call, that the federal law allowed the city to cut pensions. Now, they could have fought that ruling and appealed that. There was one minor appeal that fizzled out pretty quickly, but since more than 70% of the pensioners voted to accept the cuts, the case was more or less resolved at that point.
Question about the documentary. You're the principal script writer for this full-length documentary.
Yeah.
One of the questions is this about your book? Is it a visual version of your book? Is it something different from the book? And then where and when will we be able to see it?
Great question. It's not based on my book, so it's a separate and independent from that, which I think is a really good thing, because the book it stands on its own and reflects, I think, the best story I could tell in 2016. I finished the book in 2015, so came out in 2016, but that reflects the best story I could tell at that time. But in the time since then, I think, you know, you have more perspective and people get more candid as well about what happened. And I think that that's going to come out in this bankruptcy documentary. And so I'm just crossing my fingers that people actually want to watch a documentary about a bankruptcy. I don't know if this isn't exactly Tiger King here, you know, but I'm pretty optimistic that people are still going to find this engaging, because the people are engaging. And, you know, honestly, the city of Detroit being such a dynamic character in and of itself, the history and so much, the implications, you know, of this case being so far and wide: politics, law, philanthropy, art, certainly cities, and, you know, so all that we're trying to wrap into this documentary, not make you fall asleep. So it's really cool. One of my co-producers, Chastity Pratt from the Detroit Free Press, she also now at the Wall Street Journal, actually. But it's going to be fun. Now, when can you see it and where can you see it? Unfortunately, TBD. Don't know yet, because it's not finished. And until you finish it, then that's when you determine the distribution plan. But I'm going to remain optimistic. It'd be on like a streaming service, and certainly we plan to. There's no doubt going to be a major screening in Detroit when it happens, and that'll for sure be happening. Just don't know when, but I would say 2022. So kind of, keep an eye out.
Is there a title to the documentary?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the title is Gradually Then Suddenly, and that comes from the Ernest Hemingway book. Now I'm completely blanking on the name of the book, but The Sun Also Rises, of course. But yeah, the quote comes from one of the characters who says, "How did you go broke?" And he says, the response is, "Two ways: gradually and then suddenly." And I think that that's kind of what happened to the city of Detroit. It was a gradual devolution into bankruptcy over the course of 50, 60 years. But at the end, it happened very, very fast. And, you can see that in the prologue to my book, with this race to the courthouse, where they're trying to basically, they're literally speeding on I-96 going west to Ingham County Court in front of Rosemary Aquilina, who later became famous for her oversight of the Larry Nassar case. She's the one who was going to try to stop the Detroit bankruptcy from being filed. So it's even at the very last second, there was drama in this story.
I practiced law my whole adult life, and I'm not a litigator, but I was fascinated by the race to the courthouse and the effort to stop this whole thing. And 4:06 on a Friday afternoon, bang, suddenly just happened.
And there's accusations, to this day that the state's attorneys slow walked to the courthouse. The hearing was supposed to start at 4 p.m. And when 4 p.m. hit, the state's attorneys weren't there. And so they said, hey, we need just a few extra minutes. And they said, okay, fine, we'll wait. And as they're walking to the courthouse in those few minutes, that's when the bankruptcy was filed because they squeezed it in, and the attorneys got there and said, I'm afraid you're too late. The bankruptcy has been filed, and as a state court, you no longer have jurisdiction over this case.
Very interesting. Liam, what do you have? I have one more question from you, please.
I'd like to ask about the modern face of Detroit and how it looks now in the middle of this 10-year plan. How has the bankruptcy and the response to it informed the current operation of the municipal government in Detroit?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think one key aspect of it that has kind of been forgotten already, which is the fact that the city had a financial oversight board for several years after the bankruptcy. This was negotiated in Lansing between Republicans and Democrats as part of the grand bargain, basically, that helped resolve the case. They agreed to an oversight board that would have 10 years of oversight if necessary, but could basically temporarily be sunset if the city managed to manage its budget responsibly over the course of several years. So after several consecutive years of a budget surplus in Detroit, a word that you never would have heard in the 20 to 30 years before this case, they decided that the city no longer needed that active oversight. And so they basically mothballed that oversight board and said, we will only reactivate it if something really disastrous happens to the city budget. Now, 2020 may have qualified as something disastrous that happened to the city's budget because it, of course, looked for a while like it was going to be disastrous for city and state budgets throughout the country. But, you may have seen that tax receipts ended up far outpacing what people expected throughout the country. And so thankfully, that didn't lead to the kind of destruction of government budgets that we thought it would. Plus, federal government came through with a ton of money for states and cities. And so in the end, I don't think that really damaged the city that much, although we'll see in the long run. And, in terms of the operation today, I'll tell you this much. One thing that I remember they talked about a lot in court was we cannot allow the city to fall back into any form of corruption that, bedeviled the city for the last 10 years before it filed for bankruptcy, in particular with the Kwame Kilpatrick administration, with dozens of people ending up in prison due to, that racketeering scheme. Kwame Kilpatrick, of course, having his sentence commuted by President Trump right before he left office. So he's a free man now. So I think that's a warning sign, is the fact you may have seen several city council members now indicted or arrested or under investigation for alleged involvement in corrupt actions, and so in particular with this towing scheme. And so my former colleagues at the Detroit Free Press are doing a terrific job covering that story. That's a bit of a warning sign, I think, that because, and that's about the image again. It's not really about the finances. That's not going to destroy the city's finances. So it's a $1 billion budget. If someone steals a couple $1 million, that's not going to destroy the city's finances, but it's about the image, and that can affect who wants to invest in the city and that sort of thing. And so it's not a good sign, but perhaps it is. It's good that they're cleaning it up now, instead of letting it get worse.
Wow, it's a fascinating thing. One of the things we talked about before we started the program, Nathan, you were talking to Liam and me about kind of the behind the scenes with the federal court. The federal court here in Detroit is a magnificent old building, going back to the days of Detroit being one of the wealthiest cities in the world. It's a beautiful building, inside and out. What kind of cooperation did you get from the people who run that magnificent building? You're off in a room with your other reporters. Were you isolated? Were they helpful? That's kind of the behind the scenes sort of thing I'm fascinated by.
Yeah. Yeah. The court was in a very unusual position because the district court is the one you were speaking of on Lafayette Boulevard. The bankruptcy court's actually across the street on 4th Street. And the bankruptcy court does not have the kind of facilities to handle a case like this, where in some days you have hundreds of people at the court. And so they actually moved the bankruptcy proceedings permanently for this case only to the district court, which is, as you say, very stately. And so it was, so there was that. And then secondly, there was Rod Hansen, who was this amazing former reporter in Detroit, radio reporter, who was the public relations person for the court. He helped us as reporters navigate this process and trying to get us as much access as possible. Rod, has passed away since then, but was a legendary reporter in Detroit, won a Peabody Award on his own. And so, he was an advocate for us as journalists, but it was a very challenging case to cover as a reporter, and especially for the TV folks. I really feel bad for them because they couldn't have cameras in the courtroom. And so there's no cameras in federal court, unlike state court. And so they had no footage to play every day. And I feel bad for them. So they have to stand outside on the street, and it's really cold, and try to explain what was happening during the hearing. But they did a great job. Jim Kurtzner, Rod Maloney, good friends. They're good reporters. But I will say this, and this is interesting from a public policy perspective for everyone interested in that here. After the case was over, Judge Stephen Rhodes said he had wished that one of us media organizations had filed a pleading in this case to request cameras in the courtroom. He says he would have authorized it, which would have set off a national story, because that would have been forced the federal court system to decide whether cameras should be allowed or not. He said, we're in this courtroom deciding the future of this city's 700,000 residents, 32,000 pensioners, 66,000 pieces of art, and people can't see what's happening here. And the only way they can see it is through reporters like myself, who are hopefully doing a responsible job covering it. But it was, but he said he wished that it happened. And we, of course, now wish we had done that, because we maybe, and of course, we're a newspaper, but we have video, we can do that too. So we certainly wish we could have done that, but it's a lesson for any future reporters who cover a case like this. Try that out.
That's fascinating. I hadn't heard that story about Stephen Rhodes willing to authorize cameras in the courtroom. That would have been magnificent.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll also add this. There was another aspect of this where there was a bit more tension between us and the court, which was regarding the mediation, which was this confidential process that was basically there to decide how the creditors and the city settled this case. They're fighting, like incredibly hard. There was something called the Christmas Eve massacre that I chronicle in the book, where they forced all these really high paid attorneys to come to the court on Christmas Eve, which was like the worst thing they could imagine, and the idea that Gerald Rosen had was that if they're there on Christmas, they're going to make a deal because they want to go home. And that just shows you how the human elements of the law can actually affect these really big outcomes. And so he tried to get them to come to a deal, and they did. But it was a deal that Judge Rhodes would later reject, believe it or not. So, but we had tension over the fact that the mediation was confidential. And of course, as reporters, we want everything to be public, so we can't file a Freedom of Information Act request to get what's in mediation. So that was a little bit of tension there. But you also understand why mediation needs to be somewhat private to protect the parties involved, because they can be more honest in mediation. And the question you always ask yourself was, what was their real position? Because in public, everyone was taking extreme positions. The pensioners wanted 100%. The bondholders wanted everything. The people wanted to liquidate the art. They wanted this, they wanted that. And, that's the public posturing. There was quite a lot of that going on in this case. And what was their real position? In some cases, we'll probably never know.
Nathan Bomey, thank you so much for being with us. I have to say, I've been reading your T-shirt for the last hour.
Yes.
And this story that you wrote about is kind of encapsulated on those 3 words.
Yeah.
Nothing stops Detroit.
Exactly.
Thank you so much.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much. It was really great to be here. You can always, anyone on the line you can reach me, nbomy@usatoday.com. Google me, you find me on Twitter. It's just great to talk to you here today.
And I'm not here to to sell the book, but I can tell you it's a great read.
you
Detroit
so much.
Resurrected, published in 2016 by W.W. Norton. It's available in paperback. It's available in hardcover. I read a Google version over the weekend because I had to read it that way. It really is a good read. I want to thank the Ford Institute for Public Policy, Leadership in Public Policy and Service. Eddie Visco, the Associate Director, has worked with us to provide us with the brightest people on these conversations. Tonight, the bright people is Ian Rapoli, freshman at Albion College. Liam, sorry. Thank you for being with us.
Absolutely. Really thankful for this opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you'll end up being a journalist, not an English teacher.
I plan on it.
He's going to be scooping me anytime soon, I'm quite sure.
All right. So before we leave, I want to bring you up to date on some things coming up yet this fall with our American Democracy series presented by the War Memorial. It's an exciting fall with 2 more of these online conversations scheduled, as well as a visit, get this, from the Smithsonian Institution's Voices and Votes traveling exhibition on political participation. On Thursday, November 11 at 7 p.m., we'll add a special Veterans Day edition of these conversations. That night, Bev Weintraub, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who visited with us before, will be with us again to kick off the tour supporting her new book, which is called Wings of Gold, The First Women Naval Aviators. This book tells the important but little-known story of the United States Navy's first women aviators. Our final fall 2021 online conversation will take place about a week after that one, Wednesday, November 17. By the way, all of this is on our website. You can find it there. But on the 17th of November, Professor Thomas Wenhorn from the University of Michigan Flint will join us. He'll be talking about Alexis de Tocqueville and his work, Democracy in America, what it has to tell us about politics today. The talk is supported by the Michigan Humanities and will set the stage for our final and biggest fall 2021 American Democracy program. The Smithsonian is coming. Voices and Votes, Democracy in America. This is a traveling exhibition from the Smithsonian Institution across the river from you, Nathan. It opens in our carriage house here on the campus of the War Memorial on November 29. It will be with us through January 8th. This is really a great exhibit on political participation in all its many forms, and it's suitable for learners of all ages. We're very excited to be hosting this. This is a watershed moment for our institution. We'll be hosting Voices and Votes and be telling you more about it as the time gets closer. As always, you can learn more about these programs, register for them on the War Memorial's website, where the American Democracy offerings can currently be reached by clicking on the Patriotic button. Patriotic appears at the top of each page. And you can also find the recordings of these programs, which are made available a few days after each one of them. Again, I want to thank you, Nathan, for being with us. I learned a lot reading your book. I learned more tonight. I'm fascinated by this really watershed moment in our history. It was really great. And Liam, thank you for being with us. I apologize for calling you Nathan and Ian. Your byline will become well known to all of us. And thanks again to Eddie Visco and the Ford Institute for getting Liam with us. Thank you all, and good night.